I'll never forget the look on my dad's face that morning. There he stood, his 73-year-old frame, suddenly looking so small in our front yard, completely drenched from head to toe. Water dripped from his neatly pressed veteran's cap down his face and onto the medals pinned to his chest. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with a thousand-y stare that broke my heart. And there was Diane Matthews, or Karen, as everyone in the neighborhood secretly called her, wildly spraying him with a garden hose while screaming about respecting the flag and true patriots. My father, who had served this country for 30 years, who had taken a bullet in Vietnam and walked with a cane, ever since didn't even try to defend himself. He just stood there dignified, even in his humiliation, water pooling at his feet. This nightmare began 3 days earlier when my dad came to stay with me for the Memorial Day weekend. It had been our tradition ever since Mom passed away. Dad would visit. We'd attend the local parade and then have a small barbecue in my backyard. Simple, meaningful time together. Dad was never one for long conversations or emotional displays. His generation of military men didn't operate that way, but the quiet moments we shared told me everything I needed to know about how much these visits meant to him. This year was special because he was finally going to meet my fiancée, Melissa, who had been looking forward to getting to know the man I admired more than anyone else in the world. My neighborhood was usually peaceful, a typical suburban community with well-maintained lawns and friendly neighbors who waved as they walked their dogs. But there was one major drawback. The Homeowners Association, and specifically its president, Diane Matthews, was in her 50s with a permanently pinched expression and a clipboard that seemed surgically attached to her hand. In the 2 years I'd lived there, she'd written me up for grass that was a quarter in too high a mailbox, that was apparently the wrong shade of beige, and Christmas lights that remained up until January 3rd. But I'd managed to stay on her relatively good side by quickly complying with her ridiculous demands. Other neighbors weren't so lucky. The Williams family had been fined $300 for planting unapproved rose bushes, and poor Mr. Henderson had nearly been taken to HOA court for painting his door unauthorized burgundy instead of the approved cranberry sunset. I had warned my dad about Diane before his visit. "Just smile and nod," I told him over the phone. "She's harmless as long as you don't cross." Her dad had laughed in that quiet way of his and said he'd survived drill sergeants and enemy fire. He could handle one neighborhood busybody. Neither of us could have predicted how wrong he would be. The trouble started the very first morning of his visit. Dad was an early riser. Military habits die hard, and he'd gone out for his morning walk while I was still asleep. When I came downstairs, I found him sipping coffee on the front porch, his expression troubled. "Everything okay, Dad?" I asked, pouring myself a cup and joining him. He nodded toward the community center across the street where Diane was standing, beneath our neighborhood flag glaring in our direction. "That woman over there," he said quietly. "She yelled at me for not saluting the flag during their little morning ceremony. I was just passing by minding my own business." I explained to him that Diane had recently instituted a daily flag-raising ceremony at 8 a.m. sharp and had been pressuring all residents to attend and show proper respect. Most people ignored it or made excuses about work schedules, but Diane had been growing increasingly militant about participation. Dad shook his head. "I respect the flag more than most," he said, touching the veteran's pin on his jacket, "but I don't need to perform for the neighbors to prove it." The next morning, I accompanied Dad on his walk, partly for the exercise and partly to run interference with Diane if necessary. Sure enough, as we passed the community center during the flag ceremony, Diane was there with 3 other HOA board members. When she spotted my father, her eyes narrowed to slits. "Your father needs to show proper respect," she hissed at me as we walked by. "Standing at attention and saluting is the minimum expectation." I felt Dad tense beside me, but placed a hand on his arm. "He served for 30 years, ma'am," I replied as politely as I could manage. "I think he's earned the right to pay respects in his own way." Diane's face flushed an alarming shade of red. "Rules are rules," she snapped. "No exceptions. I thought that would be the end of it, an unpleasant encounter, but nothing more." How terribly wrong I was. The following morning, Memorial Day itself, Dad decided to sit outside with his coffee and enjoy the early morning quiet before our planned activities. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I heard the shouting. At first I couldn't make out the words, but the angry tone sent me rushing to the front door. What I saw will be burned into my memory forever. Diane Matthews was standing on my lawn garden hose in hand, spraying my elderly father with ice-cold water while screaming about patriotism and disrespect. "You think you're above the rules?" She was shrieking. "I saw you yesterday standing there like you're too good to salute. This is what happens to people who disrespect our flag." My father, his decorated veteran's cap and uniform now completely soaked, stood perfectly still. His cane gripped tightly in one hand. He didn't fight back, didn't yell. His military training and dignity wouldn't allow it, but I had no such restraints. I exploded out the front door, screaming for her to stop. "What is wrong with you? That's my father. He's a veteran." My shouting alerted the neighbors, and people began emerging from their homes, staring in shock at the scene unfolding on my front lawn. Diane finally lowered the hose but didn't back down. He refused to salute the flag during the ceremony. As HOA president, it's my duty to enforce respect for our country's symbols. The absurdity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. My father, still dripping wet, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but carried across the suddenly silent yard. "Young lady, I didn't fight for a flag. I fought for what it represents, including the freedom to not be assaulted on my son's front lawn." His words seemed to inflame Diane further. "How dare you lecture me about patriotism? I've been running the flag ceremony for 6 months while you've been—" She didn't get to finish because I had already pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I need police assistance." I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "A woman is assaulting my elderly father, a military veteran, on my property." Diane's eyes widened as reality seemed to dawn on her. She dropped the hose and took a step back. "I was enforcing HOA rules," she sputtered. "He was in violation of— There is no HOA rule that requires saluting the flag," interrupted Mrs. Castillo from next door, who had come outside to see what the commotion was about. "And even if there was, it wouldn't give you the right to assault someone." Diane, other neighbors murmured in agreement. Then Mr. Patel from across the street stepped forward with his phone held up. "I recorded the whole thing," he said. "From the moment she started yelling. I've got it all on video." Diane's face drained of color. By the time the police arrived, a small crowd had gathered. 2 officers approached, looking confused by the scene. My father, still wet, but now wrapped in a blanket Mrs. Castillo had brought over me, barely containing my rage, and Diane, who had switched tactics and was now tearfully trying to explain that she was just doing her job as HOA president. The officers separated everyone and began taking statements. When they learned that my father was a decorated veteran who had been assaulted while visiting for Memorial Day, their professional demeanor noticeably hardened toward Diane. Mr. Patel showed them the video, which clearly captured Diane trespassing on my property, verbally abusing my father and assaulting him with a hose, all while ranting about patriotism. "Ma'am, you're being placed under arrest for assault and battery trespassing and disturbing the peace," the older officer finally said, taking out his handcuffs. Diane's mouth fell open in shock. "You can't be serious. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association. I was enforcing community standards." The younger officer just shook his head as he read, "Diane, her rights. Ma'am, being HOA president doesn't give you authority to assault people, especially not veterans on Memorial Day." As they led Diane to the police cruiser, the entire neighborhood watched in stunned silence. She continued protesting, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "This is ridiculous. I was standing up for the flag. You're all going to hear from my lawyer." But her threats sounded hollow even to her own ears, I think. Just before they placed her in the back seat, she looked back at my father with an expression that might have been shame, but it vanished quickly, replaced by indignation. The cruiser drove away and suddenly the tension broke. Neighbors approached my father offering apologies and support. Mrs. Castillo brought over dry clothes and Mr. Henderson retrieved Dad's cane, which had fallen during the assault 3 days later. We learned the full extent of Diane's legal troubles. She was charged with assault and battery against an elderly person, a felony in our state criminal trespassing, and disturbing the peace. The district attorney, whose own father had served in the military, refused any plea deal. If convicted on all counts, she faced up to 5 years in prison and thousands in fines. Additionally, the HOA board immediately called an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page, complete with a still image from Mr. Patel's video showing Diane spraying my dad while he stood there in his decorated uniform. Her real estate company placed her on unpaid leave the same day. When Diane was released on bail, she had to return to the neighborhood to collect some belongings from her house. I happened to be outside with my dad when her car pulled up. She kept her head down trying to hurry inside, but froze when she saw my father sitting on the porch. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then, to my astonishment, my dad slowly stood up leaning on his cane and gave her a solemn, perfect military salute. Her face crumpled, and for the first time since I'd known her, Diane Matthews had absolutely nothing to